Part 3. The relationship between authorial and narrative audiences. When Walker Gibson and Father Ong speak, respectively, of mock readers and fictionalized audiences, they make no distinction between authorial and narrative audiences. One can agree that both the authorial and the narrative audiences are fictions. Neither of them exists in the flesh, but they are fictions in radically different senses. When speaking of the authorial audience, we might more accurately use the term hypothetical than the term fictional. For, as I have suggested, most authors, in determining the authorial audience they will write for, will try to come as close to the actual audience as possible. For to the extent that an authorial audience is invented, footnotes or other explanations will be required before the text can work as intended. Thus, while some authors such as Barth are forced, because of the subtlety of their intentions, to idealize and write for an audience they know does not exist, or does not exist in significant numbers, few authors intentionally strive for such a situation. The distance between authorial and actual audiences, in some, may be inevitable. But as Tolstoy argues in What is Art, it is generally undesirable, and authors usually try to keep the gap narrow. The narrative audience, on the other hand, is truly a fiction. The author not only knows that the narrative audience is different from the actual and authorial audiences, but he rejoices in this fact and expects his actual audience to rejoice with him. For it is this difference which makes fiction fiction, and makes the double-level aesthetic experience possible. As we shall see, the author plays with this distinction and builds much of his effect on it. Similarly, the reader's act of joining the authorial audience is not really a pretense in the same way that joining the narrative audience is. As good readers, we usually try to become the authorial audience as much as possible. Thus, the authorial audience of Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls knows quite a bit about the Spanish Civil War. If, as actual readers, we do not possess this information, we will ideally do our best to acquire it. There are, however, two circumstances under which we may pretend to join the authorial audience. First, we are often lazy. Thus, we may decide to forego a research trip to the library and instead simply pretend to understand Hemingway's politics. Underlying this pretense, however, is the knowledge that we could really understand the book if we wished, and it is clearly a qualitatively different sort of pretense than the pretense of believing that Robert Jordan, Maria, and Pablo all exist. Second, there are cases where the authorial audience differs from the actual audience not simply because it has additional facts at its disposal, as in Hemingway, but because it operates under assumptions which fundamentally contradict our normal way of thinking. Through research, we may gain a better understanding of the beliefs of another culture. But no matter how much research we do, we are unlikely actually to believe what the authorial audiences of the Iliad or From the Earth to the Moon believe. To the extent that our joining of the authorial audience is a pretense, we are that much less likely to receive the work's intended effect. But the pretense involved in joining the narrative audience does not interfere with the novel's effect. It is, on the contrary, an essential and desirable element in it. And as we have seen, the reader who does not realize that this is pretense, the reader who looks up Humbert Humbert's murder trial in the newspapers, has clearly missed the point. Obviously, the narrative and authorial audiences are closer together in some novels than in others. I would argue that the distance between these audiences is a major element in any novel structure. Indeed, I suspect that one could develop a classification of narrative literature stemming from a theory of realism expressed in terms of this distance. Surely, in the most realistic novels, War and Peace is a paradigm, the narrative audience is asked to accept very little, and usually nothing which in any way contradicts the fundamental beliefs or experiences of the authorial audience. To believe that Natasha exists, for example, in no way contradicts the authorial audience's general experiences. It is not at all improbable that such a person should exist and act as she does. At the extreme end of realism, narrative and authorial audiences are so close as to be almost indistinguishable, as in Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer. When the distinction between the two disappears entirely, we have autobiography or history. In anti-realistic or fantastic novels, Alice in Wonderland, for example, the narrative audience is asked to take on a great deal more. Beliefs which, like belief in the White Rabbit, do moreover contradict the very beliefs and experiences of the authorial audience. Obviously, the wider beliefs and experiences of the authorial audience. Obviously, the wider gap, the more unusual or outrageous the beliefs that the narrative audience is required to take on, the greater the effort required to bridge it. Thus, we become more conscious that the novel is double-leveled, and that we must employ pretense to become involved in reading it. This, in turn, increases our awareness of the novel as art, and tends to diminish our direct emotional involvement in it. The metaphor of distance may suggest the possibility of quantitative measurement, but this is obviously deceptive, for such measurement is difficult, if not impossible, especially since the distances occur along many axes at once. How, for instance, can one compare the distance the novelist causes by asking us to believe that a man can walk through walls, Marcel Amy's La Passe Morale, with the distance caused by asking us to believe that a single mad genius named Fu Manchu secretly controls the politics of half the world? Yet while such a theory of realism would not be able to assign a quantitative realism factor to every novel, it would nonetheless have interesting consequences. Most importantly, it would escape from the notion of verisimilitude, a notion which is misleading because it theoretically measures the novel against the real world, but in fact only measures the novel against the world as perceived by the current actual audience. Since perceptions of the world change with history, the verisimilitude of a novel is less a quality inherent in the novel itself than a fluctuating value dependent upon the beliefs of the particular critics who read it. But by considering the distance between narrative and authorial audience, rather than the more traditional distance between narrative and actual audience, realism can become grounded in its proper historical context. The realism of a novel will then depend upon the beliefs or the author's perception of them, common to the audience at the time when, and in the class of readers for whom, it was written, rather than upon the beliefs common to the audience by which it is now read. The works of Horatio Alger, according to this notion, are extremely realistic, despite their almost comic mimetic inaccuracy, because they conform so well to the beliefs of the audience for which they were written. Similarly, with this definition of realism, we can view realism outside the confines of schools or traditions. It is thus possible to see realism in a novelist like Alain Robbe-Grillet, even though his works hardly fall into the Tolstoy-James tradition. His novels may require considerable imagination and even creativity from the authorial audience, but at least the voyeur and jealousy do not require much pretense before experienced modern readers can join the narrative audience. Our notion of audience distance is also suggestive when considering the didactic power of fantastic novels. Didactic is a method of teaching, or it's central to teaching. And you recall that McKee distinguishes between dialectic and didactic, where dialectic is a conversation between opposing forces, didactic is where one side wins all the time. Once again, Our notion of audience distance is also suggestive when considering the didactic power of fantastic novels. It would seem that the greater the distance between authorial and narrative audiences, the less realistic the novel in our new definition, the less impact a moral lesson learned by the narrative audience is likely to have on the authorial audience. To use a Tolstoyan metaphor, the greater the distance, the less the possibility of infection from one to the other. Thus, for instance, I wonder about the power of the utopian novels of H.G. Wells. As narrative audience, we are asked to accept all kinds of scientific absurdities. Once having done this, it is not difficult to accept the necessity of socialism as well. But in our role as authorial audience, where we see the novel as a novel, our great distance from the narrative audience takes its toll. Just as we recognize the obvious fictionality of our pretended scientific beliefs, so we are apt to abandon our newly found social beliefs as well. Since the narrative audience's beliefs in the naturalistic novels of Zola are not so far from those of the authorial audience, we are less apt to be conscious of their fictionality. It is thus all the more likely that the lessons learned as narrative audience will stick for the authorial audience too. And unless the authorial audience is very distant from the actual audience, for the actual audience as well. Let me read that. That's a kind of a tricky passage there. I'll start with, since the narrative audience's beliefs in the naturalistic novels of Zola are not so far from those of the authorial audience, we are less apt to be conscious of their fictionality. It is thus all the more likely that the lessons learned as narrative audience will stick for the authorial audience too. And unless the authorial audience is very distant from the actual audience, for the actual audience as well. The act of joining the narrative audience is not, of course, the ultimate step in literary interpretation. Rather, it is the first and most elementary step. It is an essential step, however, and many novels fail to make an impact because they are unable to make their readers join the narrative audience. Such novels are usually deemed unconvincing. The ability of a novel to convince is related to, but not identical to, its realism as I have defined it above. The realism of a novel depends on the distance between authorial and narrative audiences. The novel is more or less convincing, depending on how skillfully the novelist navigates us across that distance, and on how likely we are to be standing on the dock in the authorial audience when the trip begins. Most unconvincing novels are unrealistic, although Horatio Alger's realistic epics no longer persuade. And with skill, a novelist like Kafka can make a highly unrealistic novel entirely convincing. We make the initial leap of imagination and remain with him throughout. Only after having joined the narrative audience can we begin to study the meanings of a work of art. Thus, we cannot even perceive the moral dimension in Amy's Les Passés Moraux until we pretend to accept its initial scientific premise. A person who merely insists that no one can walk through walls can hardly respond to the hero's situation as the author intended. But the act of accepting this premise does not, in itself, lay bare the story's moral dimension. Decisions as to ultimate meaning or meaning's symbolic significance, in fact, any decision about the work as art, are made by the authorial and actual audiences and not by the narrative audience. I do not wish to imply that in order to become members of the narrative audience, we must pretend to accept everything that the narrator tells us. There are unreliable narrators. An unreliable narrator, however, is not simply a narrator who does not tell the truth. What fictional narrator ever tells the literal truth? Rather, an unreliable narrator is one who tells lies conceals information, misjudges with respect to the narrative audience. That is, one whose statements are untrue not by the standards of the real world or of the authorial audience, but by the standards of his own narrative audience. It would, for example, be trivial to argue that Dostoevsky's Underground Man is unreliable because his statements are often false. He is unreliable because even after we have pretended to accept the beliefs of the narrative audience, that he, Liza, and the dinner party actually do exist, we still find that much of what he says, particularly when he analyzes motives, contradicts the other elements of his framework. In other words, all fictional narrators are false in that they are imitations, but some are imitations of people who tell the truth, some of people who lie. The narrative audience believes the narrator is a real existing historian, but it does not automatically assume that he is an accurate historian any more than in reading a work of history, we automatically assume the author to be accurate and truthful. It is probably in these terms that we have to understand William Denby's distinction between real and fictional in the passage quoted above.